August 20th, 1947, courtroom 600 at the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg. 7 men stand before the tribunal. They wear civilian clothes. They look ordinary, professional. One is a father of 4. Another held a university chair. A third published groundbreaking medical research in respected journals. Today, the judges will sentence them to death, not for combat, not for following orders on a battlefield, for medicine, for experiments, for taking the Hippocratic Oath and turning it into a blueprint for systematic murder. And here's what you need to understand before we go any further. These men had defenses. They had lawyers. They argued military necessity. They cited precedent. They claimed they were saving lives. The judges listened to all of it. And then one experiment, conducted in the winter of 1942 at Dachau concentration camp, destroyed every single defense they offered. This wasn't the most widespread experiment. It wasn't the one that killed the most people. But it was the one that convinced the judges that execution was the only possible sentence. Today, I'm going to show you exactly what happened in those freezing water tanks at Dachau, how the experiment was designed, how it was documented, and how, 5 years later, that documentation became a death warrant for the doctors who designed it. Because this isn't just about one atrocity. This is about the moment the world drew a line and said, medicine can never cross this boundary again. The Nuremberg Code, modern medical ethics, informed consent, every protection you have when you walk into a hospital today exists because of what happened in that courtroom when prosecutors opened a file marked freezing experiments, Dachau, 1942-1943. So the question isn't whether these doctors committed crimes. The evidence made that undeniable. The question is, what made this one experiment so uniquely damning that it turned a legal proceeding into a moral reckoning? Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand why 7 men in white coats became 7 names on a gallows list. But first, we need to go back to 1945, to the moment Allied investigators walked into Dachau and found something they weren't prepared for. Before we dive in, if you're interested in a deep dive historical analysis of World War II atrocities, war crimes trials, and the legal and moral decisions that shaped post-war justice using primary sources and trial transcripts, I'd really appreciate if you'd hit that subscribe button. It helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more content like this. And as we go through this story, drop a comment telling me what you think about the boundary between medical research and murder. Where's the line? I read every comment and I'm genuinely curious what you think. All right, let's get into it. April 29th, 1945. American forces liberate Dachau concentration camp in southern Germany. What they find is hell on earth. Thousands of emaciated prisoners, piles of corpses. Crematorium ovens, still warm. The scenes are so horrific that General Dwight Eisenhower orders film crews and journalists to document everything because he knows people won't believe it. But as investigators move deeper into the camp, they find something else. Something that doesn't fit the chaos of a hastily abandoned death camp. They find order. They find filing cabinets. They find laboratories with equipment carefully labeled. They find records. Meticulous, detailed scientific records. In one building, they find a large tank, empty now, but clearly designed to hold water. Next to it, thermometers calibrated for extreme cold, instruments for measuring body temperature, and on a desk nearby, a stack of folders filled with typed reports, graphs, photographs, and data tables. The reports describe experiments conducted between August 1942 and May 1943. Experiments testing human survival in freezing water. And here's what made these documents different from other Nazi atrocities. They weren't hidden. They weren't destroyed. They were preserved. Because the men who conducted these experiments didn't think they were committing crimes. They thought they were doing science. Let me explain what that means, and why that belief made these doctors more dangerous than any sadistic camp guard. The experiments had an official justification. Luftwaffe pilots shot down over the North Sea were dying of hypothermia before rescue crews could reach them. Naval personnel whose ships sank in the Arctic were freezing to death in minutes. The German military wanted to know, how long can a human survive in freezing water? And more importantly, how do you revive someone who's reached the edge of hypothermia? Legitimate questions, questions that might actually save lives. But here's the problem. Answering those questions ethically requires volunteers, informed consent, the ability to stop the experiment if the subject is in danger, safety protocols, medical oversight. The Dachau experiments had none of that. What they had instead were prisoners, men who couldn't refuse, who had no idea what was about to happen to them, who were told they were being transferred to work detail and instead found themselves strapped into a tank of ice water while doctors with stopwatches stood by taking notes. The man who designed these experiments was Dr. Sigmund Rascher. SS captain? Medical doctor? And here's what you need to understand about Rascher. He wasn't a sadist. He wasn't a brutal camp guard who enjoyed inflicting pain. He was a careerist, an ambitious researcher who saw an opportunity. In 1941, Rascher wrote directly to Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, proposing high-altitude experiments on prisoners. Himmler approved. The experiments were successful enough that Rascher proposed a second series, freezing experiments testing human survival in extreme cold. His pitch was practical, clinical, scientific. He noted that conventional research methods using animals or volunteers couldn't replicate the conditions Luftwaffe pilots actually faced. He needed subjects who could be pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance, and Dachau had an unlimited supply. Himmler approved again, and in August 1942, the freezing experiments began. Here's how they worked. Prisoners were selected from the camp population, mostly Russians, Poles, political prisoners. They were brought to a specially designated area where Rascher and his team had set up their equipment. Large tanks capable of holding a human body, temperature control systems, medical monitoring equipment, everything you'd expect in a legitimate research facility. Except for one thing, the subjects weren't patients, they were specimens. The procedure was systematic. Prisoners were stripped naked. Medical staff recorded baseline vital signs, body temperature, heart rate, blood pressure. Then the subject was immersed in a tank filled with ice water. The water temperature was precisely controlled, typically between 5 and 12 degrees Celsius, just above freezing. And then the doctors waited and watched and took notes. They monitored how long it took for body temperature to drop. They recorded the onset of unconsciousness. They measured the point at which the heart began to fail. They documented everything, muscle spasms, respiratory distress, the exact moment brain function began to deteriorate. Some prisoners died in the tanks. Their bodies were removed, autopsied, and the data was added to Rascher's reports. Others were pulled out just before death and subjected to rewarming experiments testing different revival methods. Hot baths, heated blankets, body-to-body warming using the body heat of female prisoners forced to lie naked with the victims. The survival rate depended on how aggressive the revival attempt was. Many died during rewarming. Their hearts, weakened by extreme cold, couldn't handle the stress. Their bodies went into shock. Rascher documented all of it. And here's what makes this particularly chilling. Rascher kept meticulous records. He didn't hide what he was doing. He photographed the experiments. He created detailed charts showing the correlation between water temperature, immersion time, and survival rates. He filed reports with the Luftwaffe Medical Service. He even presented his findings at a medical conference in October 1942 in Nuremberg, ironically, in the same city where he'd later be prosecuted. Why such detailed documentation? Because Rascher thought this was legitimate research. He believed he was contributing to military medicine, saving German lives. The prisoners weren't people to him. They were data points, variables in an equation. And that belief, that cold scientific detachment, is what made these experiments so legally significant, because it meant the evidence was irrefutable. When Allied investigators found those files in 1945, they weren't finding hastily scribbled notes or secondhand accounts. They were finding a complete scientific record, with photographs, with signed reports, with data that could be verified and cross-referenced. Rascher had built his own prosecution case, page by page, experiment by experiment, death by death. Let me give you a specific example. One report, dated February 1943, describes an experiment on 2 Russian prisoners. Both were immersed in ice water at 3 degrees Celsius. One was left in the tank for 60 minutes, the other for 80 minutes. The report notes their body temperatures dropped to 26 degrees Celsius, far below the point where most humans lose consciousness. The 60-minute subject died during rewarming, heart failure. The 80-minute subject died in the tank. The report includes their autopsy findings. Pulmonary edema, cardiac damage, evidence of extreme physiological stress, everything documented with clinical precision. That report, and dozens like it, would later be entered as evidence at Nuremberg. Prosecution Exhibit 139. And when defense attorneys tried to argue that these were legitimate military experiments, prosecutors would point to those reports and ask a simple question. Where is the consent form? Where is the documentation showing these men volunteered? Where's the medical ethics review? There wasn't any, because the entire premise of the experiments required involuntary subjects. Volunteers wouldn't give researchers the data they wanted. Volunteers could quit. Volunteers had rights. Prisoners had none. But here's what German leadership didn't understand in 1942 and 1943. They were creating evidence that would outlast the war. They were documenting crimes in real time. And when the Third Reich collapsed, those documents would survive, buried in filing cabinets, preserved in ministry archives, carried in briefcases by fleeing SS officers who thought they might need to prove their scientific credentials after the war. Instead, those documents became exhibit labels in a courtroom. By summer 1945, Allied investigators had assembled a staggering collection of evidence, and they faced a decision. What do we do with this? These weren't battlefield atrocities. These weren't the result of combat stress or rogue soldiers. These were planned, systematic experiments conducted by licensed physicians. How do you prosecute that? The answer would change medical ethics forever. But before we get to the courtroom, you need to understand something else, something that made the prosecutor's job both easier and more horrifying. The experiments at Dachau weren't secret. They were coordinated with the highest levels of the German military medical establishment, and that coordination left a paper trail. Let me show you how deep this went. The freezing experiments required resources, equipment, personnel, access to prisoners, and most importantly, they required approval from multiple branches of the German military medical hierarchy. Rascher reported directly to the Luftwaffe's Institute for Aviation Medicine. His supervisor was Dr. Siegfried Ruff, a respected aviation medicine researcher. Rascher's requests for equipment went through official Luftwaffe procurement channels. His experiment proposals were reviewed and approved by senior medical officers. But it goes higher. The experiments were also coordinated with Himmler's personal office. Rascher sent regular updates to Himmler's chief of staff. When Rascher needed more prisoners, he requested them through official SS channels. When he needed specific equipment, the SS arranged it. And here's the damning part. Other doctors knew. In October 1942, Rascher presented his preliminary findings at the third meeting of consulting physicians of the Luftwaffe in Nuremberg. The conference was attended by roughly 95 German aviation medicine specialists. Rascher described his freezing experiments in detail. He showed graphs. He discussed methodology. He presented survival data. Several doctors in that room would later claim they had no idea prisoners were being used involuntarily. But the presentation made it clear. Rascher explicitly stated the experiments were conducted at Dachau using camp prisoners. He described conditions that no volunteer would ever accept. Hours in near-freezing water, pushed to the point of unconsciousness, with multiple subjects dying. No one objected. No one reported it. Several doctors asked technical questions about his findings. Some requested copies of his data. A few even suggested modifications to his experimental protocol. Because here's what you need to understand. By 1942, the idea of using concentration camp prisoners for medical research had been normalized within certain circles of German military medicine. It wasn't secret, it wasn't hidden. It was an accepted practice among doctors who had convinced themselves that wartime necessity overrode peacetime ethics. Let me tell you about another doctor who attended that conference, Dr. Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician, Reich Commissioner for Health and Sanitation, one of the most powerful medical officials in Nazi Germany. Brandt knew about Rascher's experiments. He reviewed reports. He approved funding. And in 1947, he would stand trial alongside 6 other doctors in Nuremberg. The prosecution would argue that these men had created a system where medicine became murder, where the phrase, "do no harm," became meaningless, where prisoners were reduced to experimental material, no different from laboratory animals. The defense would argue something different. They would claim these experiments, while harsh, served a legitimate military purpose. They would point to examples of Allied research that pushed ethical boundaries. They would argue that wartime conditions required difficult choices, that saving German soldiers' lives justified extreme measures, and that defense might have worked, might have reduced the charges, might have resulted in prison sentences instead of execution. Except for one problem. The evidence from Dachau was too detailed, too systematic, too cold-blooded. When prosecutors presented the freezing experiment reports in court, they didn't just show brutality. They showed premeditation. They showed doctors making calculated decisions to push human subjects past the point of survival. They showed men who measured, recorded, and photographed the process of killing. And that made all the difference. December 9th, 1946. The doctor's trial begins. Officially, it's called United States of America versus Karl Brandt et al. It's case number 1 of the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings, the first of 12 trials prosecuting Nazi leadership after the main International Military Tribunal concluded. 23 defendants, 20 doctors, and 3 SS administrators. The charges, war crimes and crimes against humanity. Specifically, conducting medical experiments on prisoners without consent, causing death, torture, and permanent injury. The chief prosecutor is Brigadier General Telford Taylor. His team has spent months assembling evidence. They have documents, photographs, survivor testimony, and they have a strategy. They're not going to present every atrocity. They're going to focus on specific experiments that clearly violate any conceivable medical ethics standard. The freezing experiments are at the top of that list. Here's why the prosecution chose to emphasize Dachau. The evidence was airtight. Rascher's reports were too detailed to deny. The photographs were too clear to dismiss. The medical data was too precise to claim it was fabricated. And the death toll was undeniable. At least 90 prisoners were subjected to freezing experiments. Between 30 and 40 died, either in the tanks or during rewarming. But more importantly, the experiments demonstrated something the prosecution needed the judges to understand. This wasn't battlefield medicine. This wasn't emergency care under impossible conditions. This was planned research, conducted over months with the explicit goal of generating data regardless of how many subjects died. In other words, it was murder dressed up as science. January 1947. The prosecution begins presenting evidence. They start with documents. Report after report describing the freezing experiments, Rascher's correspondence with Himmler, requests for prisoners, equipment requisitions, conference presentations. Then they bring in the photographs, images of prisoners in ice water tanks, bodies rigid with cold, faces contorted, medical staff standing by with clipboards, recording observations. These photographs were taken by Rascher himself, proud documentation of his research. The courtroom goes silent. Even the defense attorneys, who have seen considerable evidence by this point, are visibly shaken. Because the photographs make the crime undeniable, they show doctors watching men die, not in a moment of chaos or battlefield confusion, but in a controlled environment with time to stop, time to intervene, and choosing not to. Then the prosecution calls survivors, men who were subjected to the freezing experiments and survived. Their testimony is devastating. One survivor describes being selected for special duty and brought to Rascher's facility. He describes being stripped, examined, and immersed in ice water. He describes the pain, the cold so intense it felt like burning, the moment he lost sensation in his limbs, the point where he stopped feeling anything at all and thought he was dying. He describes waking up later, hours later, confused and in agony. He describes watching other prisoners go through the same process and never wake up. He describes Rascher taking notes throughout, clinical and detached, treating human suffering like data collection. The defense attorneys face an impossible task. How do you defend doctors who documented their own crimes? They try several approaches. First, they argue military necessity. Defense attorney Dr. Robert Servatius stands and addresses the tribunal. He argues that Germany was in a total war, that Luftwaffe pilots were dying in the North Sea, that naval crews were freezing to death in Arctic waters, that the research, while harsh, could save thousands of German lives. He points out that no nation's military medical research is entirely ethical during wartime. The prosecution responds with a simple question. Did any of these prisoners volunteer? Did any of them give informed consent? Did any of them have the right to refuse? The answer to all three questions is no. And that single fact undermines the entire military necessity argument, because medical ethics, even in wartime, requires consent. Soldiers who volunteer for dangerous duty know the risks. Prisoners forced into ice water tanks don't get that choice. Second, the defense tries to argue that the experiments weren't as deadly as prosecutors claim. Defense attorneys point to Rascher's reports showing some subjects survived. They argue that survival rates improved as Rascher refined his rewarming techniques. They suggest this proves the research had genuine scientific merit. The prosecution's response is more detailed. They bring in expert witnesses, American and British military doctors who specialize in hypothermia research. These experts review Rascher's reports and methodology, and they tear it apart. One expert, a U.S. Navy physician, testifies that Rascher's experimental design was fundamentally flawed. The data was contaminated by variables Rascher never controlled for. Different subjects had different body mass, different health conditions, different levels of exhaustion from camp life. The water temperatures weren't consistently maintained. The rewarming protocols changed between experiments. In other words, the research wasn't even good science. It was torture that produced unreliable data. Subjects died, and the data couldn't even be used effectively because the methodology was so poor. The expert goes further. He testifies that legitimate hypothermia research was being conducted by Allied militaries during the same period, using volunteers, using controlled conditions, using protocols that stopped the experiment if the subject was in danger. And that research produced better data without killing anyone, so the defense's argument collapses. The experiments weren't necessary. They weren't scientifically valid. They were simply murder disguised as research. Third, the defense tries the following orders argument. Several defendants claim they were ordered to participate, that refusing would have been insubordination, that they had no choice. This argument works for some defendants. Lower-level medical staff who assisted but didn't design the experiments receive lighter sentences. But for the senior doctors, the men who designed and approved the experiments, this defense fails completely, because the evidence shows they weren't just following orders. They were enthusiastic participants. Rascher wrote letters to Himmler volunteering to conduct experiments. Other doctors requested access to camp prisoners for their own research. Conference presentations showed doctors discussing results with professional interest, not moral horror. These men weren't soldiers following battlefield orders under threat of court-martial. They were researchers pursuing career advancement. The experiments boosted their reputations, generated publications, secured funding and promotions. The tribunal hears all of this. Weeks of testimony, hundreds of documents, dozens of witnesses. And slowly, the legal framework begins to take shape. The judges aren't just deciding whether these specific men are guilty. They're establishing a new legal principle, a line that medicine can never cross. Let me explain what that means. Before the doctor's trial, international law didn't clearly address medical experiments on prisoners. The Geneva Conventions protected wounded soldiers and prisoners of war from violence, but didn't specifically address medical research. There was no clear legal framework. The prosecution had to argue that the experiments violated basic principles of humanity, that certain acts are crimes regardless of whether specific laws prohibit them, that forcing prisoners into deadly medical experiments is murder, even if the murderer wears a white coat and takes notes. And the evidence from Dachau made that argument undeniable, because Rascher's reports showed premeditation. They showed doctors making calculated decisions. They showed systematic killing conducted over months, documented with scientific precision. By March 1947, the prosecution is preparing its closing arguments, and they make a strategic decision. Instead of presenting every atrocity, every crime, every defendant's actions equally, they're going to focus the judge's attention on specific experiments that clearly cross the line. Experiments so indefensible that no legal sophistry can excuse them. The freezing experiments at Dachau are the centerpiece of that strategy. Here's why. The experiments had clear documentation showing exactly who authorized them, who conducted them, and who knew about them. The death toll was significant, but not so overwhelming that it became abstract. The suffering was intense and prolonged. And most importantly, the experiments had no legitimate scientific value that could even theoretically justify the cost in human life. Prosecutors present a detailed timeline. August 1942, Rascher begins experiments. Between August and October, approximately 50 prisoners are subjected to freezing. At least 15 die. Rascher presents preliminary findings at the October conference. Between November 1942 and May 1943, experiments continue. Another 40 prisoners tested. Another 15 to 20 deaths. Throughout this period, senior medical officers receive reports. They review data. They approve continued funding. They do nothing to stop the experiments. They don't question the ethics. They don't demand consent procedures. They treat it as normal military research. And here's the moment that shifts everything. The moment when the defense's arguments fall apart completely. The moment when the judges realize these aren't doctors who made difficult wartime choices. These are men who crossed a line so fundamental that execution becomes not just justified, but necessary. That moment comes during the testimony of Dr. Franz Blaha, a survivor and physician who was imprisoned at Dachau. Dr. Blaha takes the stand in January 1947. He's a Czech physician who was arrested for resistance activities and imprisoned at Dachau from 1941 to 1945. Unlike other survivor witnesses who were victims of the experiments, Blaha was forced to assist in the camp's medical facilities. He saw everything. He kept mental records. And his testimony has the authority of a medical professional, describing what other medical professionals did. The prosecutor asks him to describe the freezing experiments. Blaha's testimony is calm, clinical, devastating. He describes watching Rascher select prisoners. He describes how prisoners were told they were going to a light work duty and instead found themselves in a medical facility. He describes their confusion when they realized what was about to happen, their terror when they were strapped down and lowered into ice water. He describes hearing screams from the building where the experiments took place, screams that lasted for hours. He describes seeing bodies carried out afterward, blue and rigid. He describes performing autopsies on some of those bodies and finding massive internal damage, frozen tissue, pulmonary hemorrhaging, heart failure. And then Blaha says something that changes the entire tone of the trial. He testifies that Rascher and his team were excited during the experiments, that they discussed findings with enthusiasm, that when a prisoner survived an extreme immersion time, they celebrated it as a scientific breakthrough, that when a prisoner died, they discussed it as an interesting data point. The judges lean forward. The courtroom is absolutely silent. Because what Blaha is describing isn't just cruelty. It's not even just systematic murder. It's something worse. It's the complete abandonment of human empathy by men trained to heal. Defense attorneys try to cross-examine. They ask if Blaha is certain about what he witnessed, if perhaps his memory is colored by years of imprisonment, if he might be exaggerating. Blaha's response is simple and devastating. He's a physician. He knows how to observe. He knows how to document. And he has no reason to lie because the physical evidence, all those reports and photographs that prosecutors have already entered into evidence, supports everything he's saying. The defense has no effective response, and the judges' faces make their reaction clear. This isn't a case where both sides have legitimate arguments. This is a case where one side committed crimes so fundamental that no legal gymnastics can excuse them. As the trial continues through spring 1947, patterns emerge. The freezing experiments weren't an isolated incident. The court hears about high-altitude experiments also conducted by Rascher, about malaria experiments, about sulfanilamide drug testing, about bone, muscle, and nerve transplant experiments, about seawater experiments testing how long humans can survive drinking salt water. Each experiment shares common features: no consent, extreme suffering, significant death rates, meticulous documentation, and the participation of licensed physicians who knew exactly what they were doing. But among all these atrocities, the freezing experiments remain the focal point. Why? Because the evidence is so complete. Because the death toll is so well documented. Because the photographs make it viscerally real. And because the experiment's premise, testing human survival in extreme cold, had such a thin veneer of military justification that it perfectly illustrated how easily research becomes torture. Let me explain that last point. The defense argued that Luftwaffe pilots really were dying of hypothermia. That's true. The defense argued that understanding cold water survival could save lives. That's theoretically true. But the prosecution showed that the specific methodology, immersing prisoners for hours in near-freezing water until they died, went far beyond what was necessary to gather useful survival data. An Allied expert witness testified that basic hypothermia survival information could be gathered by observing shipwreck survivors, interviewing downed pilots who were rescued, analyzing existing medical literature, and conducting limited volunteer studies with strict safety protocols. You didn't need to kill dozens of prisoners to understand that humans die when their core body temperature drops below 28 degrees Celsius. That was already known. What Rasher was really testing wasn't survival. It was the precise limits of human endurance. How much suffering a human body could withstand. How long death could be delayed. What rewarming techniques might bring someone back from the edge. These weren't medical questions. These were curiosity questions. Research for the sake of research. And that made the deaths not casualties of military necessity, but murder in service of academic ambition. By July 1947, the trial is approaching its conclusion. Both sides have presented their cases. The tribunal adjourns to consider its verdict. The judges face an unprecedented task. They're not just determining guilt, they're establishing legal precedent that will govern medical research for generations. They're deciding where the line is, what medicine can never do, what no military emergency can justify, and whether crossing that line merits execution. The deliberations take weeks. The judges review evidence. They consult legal experts. They draft detailed written opinions explaining their reasoning, because they know this verdict will be scrutinized by historians, legal scholars, and medical ethicists for decades. Quick reminder, if you're finding this analysis valuable and you haven't already, please take a second to like this video. It really helps with the YouTube algorithm and lets me know this type of deep dive content is what you want to see more of. And drop a comment letting me know, do you think the death penalty was appropriate for these crimes, or would life imprisonment have been sufficient? I'm genuinely curious what you think about how justice should be served for systematic atrocities. All right, back to the story. August 20th, 1947. The tribunal reconvenes. The courtroom is packed. International press, military observers, legal experts, survivors hoping for justice. The defendants sit in two rows, their faces tense, knowing that some of them may be sentenced to death. Judge Walter Beals, presiding, begins reading the judgment. The first part is procedural, jurisdiction, legal framework. The establishment that crimes against humanity can be prosecuted even when committed by nationals against their own citizens during wartime. Then the judgment shifts to specific defendants and specific experiments. And when it reaches the section on the freezing experiments, the language becomes sharp, unambiguous. The judges don't just find the defendants guilty. They explain, in detail, why these experiments represent something beyond ordinary war crimes. The judgment states that the freezing experiments lacked any scientific justification that could possibly excuse the suffering inflicted, that the experiments were conducted without consent and with full knowledge that subjects would die or suffer permanent injury, that prisoners were selected specifically because they were powerless and expendable, that the deaths were not accidental consequences of research, but expected outcomes that researchers documented with clinical detachment. The tribunal emphasizes a specific point. The researchers weren't trying to minimize harm while gathering necessary data. They were pushing subjects to extremes specifically to see what would happen. They were testing limits, not therapies, and that distinction made the experiments murder, not medicine. The judgment continues. It addresses the defense's arguments one by one and systematically dismantles each. Military necessity? Irrelevant when the research methodology guarantees deaths that could be avoided. Following orders? Not applicable when the researchers volunteered and showed enthusiasm. Scientific value? Negated by the fundamentally flawed methodology that produced unreliable data. And then the judgment makes a broader point, a point that transcends this specific trial. The tribunal states that certain principles of medical ethics are so fundamental that they apply regardless of national law, military orders, or wartime conditions, that consent is absolute, that human subjects must never be reduced to experimental material, that physicians bear a special obligation that military rank or state authority cannot override. This is the birth of what will become the Nuremberg Code. 10 principles governing medical research involving human subjects. Principles that begin with one absolute requirement. Voluntary consent of the human subject is essential, not preferred, not ideal when circumstances allow. essential, always, no exceptions. The judgment explains that the evidence from Dachau, specifically the freezing experiments, made this principle unavoidable, because Rascher's reports showed exactly what happens when consent is eliminated, when prisoners become specimens, when death becomes data. The judges cite specific reports, specific photographs, specific death counts. They walk through the evidence showing that researchers knew subjects were dying, and continued anyway. That researchers documented suffering in detail but never stopped to question whether they should. That the entire apparatus of scientific research, peer review, conferences, publications, was corrupted by the absence of that single fundamental principle, consent. And now comes the sentencing phase, the moment when legal judgment becomes moral reckoning. The tribunal announces that 7 defendants will be sentenced to death by hanging. The names? Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician and the most senior medical official in the Dach. Rudolf Brandt, Himmler's administrative aide who coordinated prisoner transfers. Joachim Mrgowski, chief of hygiene at the SS who oversaw multiple camp experiments. Wolfram Sievers, Reich business manager of the Ahnenerbe, the SS research organization. Victor Breck, organizer of the T4 euthanasia program. Waldemar Hoven, chief doctor at Buchenwald. Karl Gebhardt, senior SS physician. Of these 7, multiple defendants had direct connections to the Dachau freezing experiments. Brandt approved them. Sievers facilitated them. Their signatures appear on approval documents, funding requests, prisoner transfer orders. 5 defendants receive life imprisonment. 4 receive prison terms ranging from 10 to 20 years. 7 are acquitted, though several face immediate rearrest for other crimes. The death sentences shock the medical community, not because anyone doubts the crimes occurred, but because execution seems so final. Some observers argue that life imprisonment would be more appropriate, that these men should be studied, their pathology analyzed, their descent from healer to killer examined for warning signs. But the tribunal's reasoning is clear and deliberate. And these men didn't just violate medical ethics, they systematically corrupted an entire profession. They turned hospitals into laboratories of death. They made doctor a word prisoners feared. And most damningly, they documented their crimes with pride, intending to publish, to advance their careers, to gain recognition for research built on corpses. The judgment specifically cites the freezing experiments in explaining why execution is necessary. The tribunal notes that these experiments show planning, persistence, and complete moral bankruptcy. That Rascher conducted experiments for nearly a year, watching dozens of men die, and never once reconsidered. That senior doctors reviewed his work and saw an opportunity for advancement, not a crime against humanity. The judges conclude that some crimes are so fundamental, so destructive of basic human values, that the only proportionate response is execution. That allowing these men to live would suggest their crimes were somehow less than murder. That the court must send an unmistakable message. Medicine has limits, and crossing them carries the ultimate penalty. June 2nd, 1948. Landsberg Prison, Bavaria. The executions are carried out. 7 men who once wore white coats climbed 13 steps to a gallows. The process is swift and clinical, efficient, not unlike the experiments they conducted. Karl Brandt's last words are reportedly a defense of his actions. He claims he was trying to help the German people, that history will vindicate him. History has not been kind. The executions mark a turning point, not just in law, but in the fundamental understanding of medical ethics. The trial established principles that now govern all human subject research worldwide. Every medical study, every clinical trial, every experiment involving humans traces its ethical framework back to those judgments issued in Nuremberg. The Nuremberg Code becomes the foundation for all subsequent medical ethics frameworks. The Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, the Belmont Report in 1979, modern institutional review boards, informed consent forms. All of it stems from the recognition, forced by the evidence from Dachau, that medicine without consent is not medicine at all. Let me show you why this matters today. Why a series of experiments conducted in 1942 and prosecuted in 1947 still shapes every interaction you have with medical science. When you participate in a clinical trial, you sign a consent form. That form exists because of Dachau. When researchers explain risks and benefits before you agree to participate, that requirement exists because of what the judges saw in those freezing experiment reports. When institutional review boards evaluate research protocols before they're approved, that entire system exists because the Nuremberg Tribunal decided that medical research needs external oversight. The principle is simple. Your body belongs to you. No doctor, no matter how qualified, no matter how important the research, no matter how many lives might theoretically be saved, can use your body for experiments without your informed voluntary consent. That principle seems obvious now. In 1947, it wasn't codified anywhere in international law. It became law because prosecutors laid out Rascher's reports on a table in Nuremberg and forced the world to confront what medicine looks like when that principle disappears. But here's something most people don't know. The legacy of the Dachau experiments is complicated and morally fraught in ways that go beyond the trial. After the war, questions emerged about what to do with the data. Rascher's freezing experiments, flawed as they were, generated information about hypothermia that didn't exist elsewhere. Some military researchers quietly consulted the data. A few scientific papers published in the 1950s and 1960s referenced the findings without clearly stating where they came from. This created an ethical crisis. Should data obtained through torture ever be used? Even if it might save lives? Even if the victims are already dead and nothing can undo their suffering? The medical community remains divided. Some argue that using the data validates the experiments, suggests they had value, dishonors the victims. Others argue that refusing to use potentially life-saving information is another form of tragedy, that the victims died whether we use the data or not. Most major medical journals now refuse to publish any research citing Nazi experiment data. The consensus is that the ethical contamination is too severe, that legitimizing torture-derived data, even data from 80 years ago, sends a dangerous message about what's acceptable in pursuit of knowledge. But the debate itself proves why the doctor's trial mattered. It forced medicine to reckon with its own capacity for evil, to acknowledge that the scientific method, that pursuit of knowledge, that professional detachment can be corrupted, that doctors can become killers when ethics are subordinated to ambition or ideology or the belief that some lives matter less than others. The freezing experiments weren't the worst atrocities committed during World War II, not in scale, not in death toll. But they were unique in their methodical perversion of medicine. They showed what happens when healing becomes harm, when scientific curiosity overrides human empathy, when physicians forget that before you can be a good researcher, you must be a good person. And that's why the judges imposed death sentences, not just as punishment, but as a message, a line drawn in history, a declaration that some boundaries are absolute and crossing them places you beyond redemption. The 7 men executed in June 1948 weren't the only guilty parties. Hundreds of doctors participated in Nazi medical experiments. Most were never prosecuted. Some went on to successful post-war careers. A few even continued in medical research, their wartime activities quietly forgotten or overlooked. But the 7 who hanged at Landsberg became symbols, proof that medical degrees don't grant immunity, that I was doing research isn't a defense for murder, that the white coat carries obligations that no order, no emergency, no scientific goal can override. So here's what you need to understand as we close. The Dachau freezing experiments weren't an aberration. They were the logical endpoint of a system that classified some humans as expendable, that subordinated ethics to ideology, that allowed ambition to override conscience. The doctors who conducted those experiments weren't monsters. They were careerists, professionals, men who saw an opportunity and took it, who convinced themselves that the suffering of a few prisoners was acceptable if it generated data that might help German soldiers, who documented their work carefully because they believed they were doing science. And that's the truly terrifying part. These men didn't think they were committing crimes. They thought they were advancing knowledge. Right up until the moment judges sentenced them to death, many believed they'd done nothing wrong. The Nuremberg tribunal's genius was forcing the world to confront that delusion, to establish in law what should have been obvious in conscience. Consent matters. Human dignity matters. Medicine has limits. And crossing those limits transforms healers into murderers. Today, those principles are embedded in every medical school curriculum, every research protocol, every interaction between doctor and patient. You have rights when you enter a hospital or clinical trial. Those rights exist because of what happened when they didn't. Because prosecutors opened files from Dachau and showed judges what medicine becomes when ethics disappear. The freezing experiments killed approximately 30 to 40 prisoners. That's the direct death toll. But the experiment's true impact is measured differently, in the millions of research subjects protected by informed consent requirements, in the clinical trials that proceed ethically because oversight exists, in the doctors who learn medical ethics alongside anatomy and pharmacology, in the institutional review boards that reject unethical research before it begins. One experiment, conducted in secrecy at a concentration camp, documented with clinical precision, prosecuted with legal rigor, and transformed into a foundation of modern medical ethics. That's the legacy. That's why it mattered. And that's why, nearly 80 years later, we're still talking about what happened in those ice water tanks at Dachau. So those are the facts. The freezing experiments at Dachau, the meticulous documentation that became evidence, the trial that forced medicine to confront its own capacity for evil, the death sentences that drew a permanent line, and the principles that emerged to ensure it never happens again. But here's my question for you, and I genuinely want to know what you think. The data from those experiments still exists, locked away in archives, mostly unused because of ethical concerns. If you knew that using that data, that torture-derived information, could save someone's life today, would you use it? Does refusing to use it honor the victims, or does it waste their suffering? Is there ever a circumstance where the ends justify the means, or are some methods so corrupt that nothing they produce can be redeemed? And here's another question. The Nuremberg Code established that voluntary consent is absolutely essential. But modern medicine is complicated. Emergency treatments where patients can't consent, psychiatric research with subjects who may not fully comprehend, pediatric trials where children can't legally consent. We've created exceptions to the absolute rule. Are those exceptions justified, or are we slowly eroding the principle that Nuremberg established? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read everything. These questions don't have easy answers. That's why they matter. If you found this deep dive valuable, please subscribe to the channel. I analyze World War II atrocities, war crimes trials, and the legal and moral decisions that shaped modern ethics using primary sources and trial documents. Hit that like button if you want more content exploring the darkest chapters of history and the lessons we're supposed to learn from them. Thanks for watching. And remember, the protections you have when you interact with medical science today exist because of what happened when those protections didn't. That's not abstract history. That's the legacy of every person who suffered in Rasher's tanks, and every judge who decided their suffering meant something. I'll see you in the next one.